Good morning.
Good morning.
We stand here today on the eve of the 44th anniversary of the murder and assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And I'm pleased to be joined today by the chair of the North Carolina NAACP Religious Affairs Committee, Reverend Dr. Curtis Brown, president of the local branch here and pastor of New Light Baptist Church, and also the co-chair of the NAACP Religious Affairs Committee, Pastor James R. Woodson on my left, as well as Reverend Gatewood, who is the coordinator for our historic Thousands on Jones Street People's Coalition, and this host of other faith leaders here with us today. We are here today to announce a statewide effort. 1,000 churches, temples, and mosques, 100% voter registration campaign of their active membership. From the anniversary of the murder of the assassination of Dr. King, which is tomorrow, and when we think about Dr. King, we are reminded, as he reminded us, as a social gospel evangelical. I want to say that specifically to the media. He was a social gospel evangelical. He gave his life for civil rights, voting rights, and labor rights, and economic justice. He and so many others like him down through the ages in the social gospel evangelical tradition have taught us that the values of faith require that we be concerned about policies that impact the poor, children, the sick, the vulnerable, and those on the margins. We find it throughout our scriptures in my faith, Isaiah 10, Isaiah 58, Luke 4, throughout the scriptures. And so on from the anniversary of his assassination, which is tomorrow, through August 28th of this year, which is the 49th anniversary of the March on Washington, the North Carolina NAACP and its religious constituents will call upon 1,000 churches, temples, and mosques to register 100% of their active parishioners to vote. After examining the data and the public policy, the North Carolina NAACP renders the opinion that North Carolina is in a state of emergency when it comes to public education funding, poverty and jobs, equal protection under the law, injustices in the criminal justice system, access to health care, the protection of civil and constitutional rights, environmental protection and immigration rights for many North Carolinians. Civic engagement is of paramount importance, and the NAACP believes that expanding participation in our democracy is critical for this state to choose a better way. We believe in a very serious way that people of faith must cross-examine the current state of public policy. The continuing brokenness, race-class disparities, and injustices within our state and our society require this cross-examination by the NAACP and the religious community. When you have groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, better known as ALEX, spoon-feeding state legislators with regressive and copycat legislation, which is at the center of a national campaign to suppress our voting power. And then at the same time, they push stand your ground laws that give cover for deadly acts of racial profiling like we have seen in the Trayvon Martin case. When we see this going on and the devastating impact it is having on public policy, the civil rights, religious, and progressive community must march, we must meet, we must raise our voices, and we must maximize the full strength of the black, brown, and progressive vote. That's right. The 1,000 churches, temples, and mosques 100% voter registration campaign is an aggressive endeavor and will be attached to our other efforts by the NAACP, where we will use social media to engage in mass voter registration, door-to-door canvassing for registration, email and text and Twitter and robocalls. But we start in the church. It has always been at the forefront of shifting the political debate and the public agenda. This endeavor, we will use it to match the extreme right's attack on the rights of African Americans, the elderly, the poor, women, and other minorities. During this electoral season, the North Carolina NAACP is our historic Thousands on Jones Street People's Assembly Coalition. Our faith partners will engage in statewide efforts of mass, nonpartisan organizing to protect the vote. Number 2, mass, nonpartisan voter education on the issues. And number 3, mass, nonpartisan expansion, mobilization, and participation in the voting process. The reality is national movements are built from the state up, not from the top down. And we understand that in North Carolina very clearly. Why are we in a state of emergency? Representation of minorities is in a state of emergency when our General Assembly uses high-paid, out-of-state consultants to create redistricting maps that pick apart black communities block by block, person by person, to ensure their political prosperity at the expense of the power of the African-American vote. It is in a state of emergency when the NAACP and others are in court challenging these maps that have stacked, packed, and isolated black voters more than any map since the 1890s, in another attempt to undermine black, brown, and progressive coalition and fusion politics. Voting rights are in a state of emergency. When a state and some of its leaders want fewer people to vote, a voter ID requirement would disenfranchise more than 500,000 registered voters in North Carolina. Mostly those who have long been victims of voter suppression tactics before. African Americans are nearly twice as likely as whites not to have a government ID. More than 150,000 elderly voters to whom we owe so much would be denied a ballot. Many of them can remember a time when people died so that African Americans and other minorities could vote. The leadership in the General Assembly is holding back millions of dollars today in federal Help America Vote Act funds that would help local boards of election expand access to the ballot in 2012. This same group wants to repeal same-day registration and voting, shorten the early voting period, and ban early voting on Sunday. We are in a state of emergency that requires that we broaden and deepen the electorate. Public education in North Carolina is in a state of emergency. When $2 billion is cut from public education over the next 2 years, over $800 million from K through 12, $250 million from community college, $700 million from university. And when these cuts were made, it caused North Carolina to drop to 49th in the nation in per pupil spending on public education, forced tuition hikes that will undermine access to higher education for poor and minority students, and pass legislation that will lead to the resegregation of our schools. This state of emergency requires a broadening and a deepening of the electorate. Healthcare justice is in a state of emergency. When the funding for Medicaid will be cut by nearly $2 billion over the next 2 years in North Carolina. Almost $700 million in state funding and $1.3 billion in loss of federal matching dollars. We have a state of emergency when there is a chorus to stop health care reform, when 25% of African Americans in North Carolina currently have no health insurance. We are in a state of emergency in the criminal justice system. Whenever a Southern legislator chooses to be against racial justice, tries to repeal a Racial Justice Act, which only gives the courts a tool to ensure that race is not a factor in anyone's death sentence. They also slash funding for indigent service and public offenders, who are often the only hope, which is often the only hope for young black men and women and poor men and women to escape unequal and unfair treatment in the criminal justice system. We are in a state of emergency. When the State Bureau of Investigation crime labs are found to be intentionally perjuring evidence for trial, while at the same time 7 men have been exonerated from death row who would have been wrongfully killed by the state of North Carolina if the system had worked faster. These realities require and demand a deepening and a broadening of the electorate. Economic justice is in a state of emergency. When we have 1.6 million North Carolinians living in poverty, over 600,000 of them are children. We have double-digit unemployment amongst African Americans and Latinos. Over 40% of African American and Latino children living in poverty, and 1 out of every 4 African Americans. And some counties where the number of poor people is as high as 30 to 40%. We have a state of emergency when amidst this campaign to take us backwards, so much of the current leadership is ignoring the plight of the poor and refusing to focus on job creation.
That's right.
We have a state of emergency when pre-K education and the legislature passes a budget in the middle of the night that is found to be by a Republican judge to violate the constitutional rights of poor and minority 4-year-old children by cutting funds for early childhood education. We are in a state of emergency. When equal protection under the law and the North Carolina Constitution are being challenged, when there is a synthesis of a plan and purpose by regressive forces to roll back voting rights, to roll back educational rights, to roll back civil rights, and to roll back constitutional rights in a strategy to undermine the fundamental role of government, which is to operate for the good of the whole, provide equal protection under the law, and ensure liberty and justice for all. And it is especially concerning in a southern state for powers to set a precedent whereby a majority votes on the rights of a minority in an attempt to move toward a limited states' rights agenda as a way of undermining the broad protections of our Constitution. In all of these areas and in even more, we are in a state of emergency when it comes to public policy, and the electorate cannot be narrowed. It must be broadened. It must be deepened. And we as faith leaders who understand the call of the social gospel are calling on 1,000 churches, 1,000 temples, and 1,000 mosques to register 100% of their active membership, that we might be engaged in the political process, that we might help reshape the political discussion and the political dialogue. And so at this time,